Good morning. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Storage as a Transmission Asset Stakeholder meeting to discuss the second revised route proposal. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I'm also joined by Carl Meeson, who will be the primary presenter for today. As with all of our initiatives, the presentation and all related material for this webinar can be found on the Stakeholder Processes webpage located on the drop-down menu under the Stay Informed tab on our KISO.com website, and then you would notice this specific initiative under the Current Initiatives section. Our agenda for today's meeting, as you can see, is to continue discussing how we've shaped our proposal to address stakeholder input, and we, of course, appreciate all of the input from you all to date. We'll begin the morning, as you can see, with the scope and background, followed by the transmission cost recovery options, shortly after that lunch, and then continuing the session with contractual arrangements between the ISO and the SATA, accessing market revenues, market participation notification, and then finally the allocation to high or low voltage proposal. As most, and hopefully all of you know by now, this is a simple display of our stakeholder process, which, as you can see, utilizes the input obtained by stakeholders between each proposal iteration, after which we carry the proposal forth to our board for consideration for approval. And now moving on to the current timeline, as you can see, after today, we will be taking comments in early November, which is November 6th, followed by the draft final proposal in mid-December. In addition, the calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to recordings after the meetings. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings. Of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you have a question in the room, as I mentioned, please state your name and the company that you represent. And for folks on the lines, to raise your hand, please press #2. And lastly, as most of you know by now, we will be transitioning away from our traditional market notices and towards our one-stop email called the Daily Briefing. So we encourage you guys to go sign up for that on our website. And without further ado, I'll introduce Carl.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Today's expectation, we have the agenda, as Jimmy noted. It's a plan for the worst, hope for the best kind of morning. I do not think we will be here until 3 o'clock. So I'm going to try and limit my discussion. Again, questions are always welcome with stuff that we've covered previously, trying to focus really primarily on the issues and items that have changed most significantly from previous iteration. We got, I think it was 28 sets of comments on the last round, so it seems to be a fairly popular topic. So with that, again, this is all going to be, these first few slides are quite frankly going to be a lot of repetition, but again, I find it's always helpful to do a little bit of level setting first thing in these meetings because not everybody has been as active or able to be present at every single meeting, so just kind of keeping everybody on the same page to get going. So really what we're looking at in the Storage as a Transmission Asset initiative is basically how to utilize resources if it is selected for cost of service-based transmission service. So again, not looking at the transmission planning process, but more really looking at once the resource has been selected through that process, allowing it to have opportunities to participate in the market to the benefit of ratepayers, and again, make sure that the resource is utilized effectively and efficiently. In addition to discussing what is in scope, it's also important to talk about what is not in scope. Again, we just find this helps kind of level set. We are not here today to talk about the transmission planning process. We have provided in each iteration a little bit more detail about the transmission planning process. There's very little updates in the most recent iteration, but we've maintained that in the appendix just so that those of you that are coming in a bit later in the process have an opportunity to kind of go back and see what ground we've already walked. Again, also not looking at the framework for the competitive solicitation, the Phase 3 process in our transmission planning process. or the cost allocation methodologies that we use when those rate-based assets are determined and put forward. And then finally, we are also not talking about beyond the scope is the resource adequacy concepts. We're looking at resources that the whole point of them is to provide a transmission service if that will have impacts on local capacity requirements. So trying to say we can lower local capacity requirement and give it resource adequacy capacity is a bit of a double counting aspect for us. So we're looking at this. It is not, these resources will not be eligible for RA capacity value. So again, we're looking at that as not an issue that we'll cover within the scope of the initiative. Again, we kind of have that ever persistent FERC policy statement that's hanging out there that we've been working through and trying to frame our proposal within the context of and identify the issues that FERC has laid out there and try and make sure that those are addressed, including the double cost recovery question and not allowing for double cost recovery, making sure that we don't inappropriately have suppressed market prices from those assets that are, the SADA assets that are fully rate-based and have full cost of service. We'll talk a little bit more today about one of the big changes we've made is to try and readjust how we're thinking about that, because quite frankly, one of our proposals in the last iteration was well understood and appreciated, but universally disliked. So we're taking stakeholder feedback on that one and trying an alternative approach. And again, also making sure that the ISO is able to maintain its independence through the entirety of this process when we have the resources available to us, making sure that, again, we don't have a vested interest in how that resource operates, other than when we tell it to. So we did get a little bit more guidance from FERC recently. Specifically, they issued a decision in the Nevada Hydro request for declaratory order. Basically, our interpretation of that is FERC came out and said, we're not saying whether a resource is or isn't through the policy statement. That was not the goal. It was simply to say, if it is determined to be a transmission asset, these are the things that need to be done. So it was, again, a bit more clarity on how to think about this, so it wasn't an explicit directive to any specific resource. As I mentioned earlier, we have gone through in some detail through, I think, the first 2 or 3 iterations of this stakeholder process with really some educational information about the transmission planning process and the evaluation processes within it. So again, with the understanding that there is some flexibility within those processes and they're adequately designed to date to manage and handle SADA resources. This again has proven to be the case. We have approved 2 storage facilities as transmission assets. So again, we've seen it in practice, so we know that that works. Again, all of this information and supporting documentation is provided in the appendix of this second revised straw proposal. And if there are any questions as I go through this information, please don't hesitate to ask. So again, we did want to try and reiterate and clarify when we'd be looking at storage as a transmission asset. I think our preference is and has been throughout the process that to the extent possible, we think that most storage resources are best situated as market resources procured through a LSE procurement process. There are, however, instances where they may be providing a specific transmission service and are appropriately considered through the ISO's transmission planning process. Specifically, they have to provide a transmission service, voltage support or mitigate the thermal overloads. They have to meet an ISO identified need, whether it be reliability, economic, or policy-based. They have to still be the most efficient or the more efficient or cost-effective solution to meet the identified needs. So again, there'll be an opportunity in the transmission planning process to assess those side by side with other proposals to address the identified need. Increase the capacity, efficiency, or reliability of an existing new transmission facility. This is to be differentiated from and distinguished from substituting for other energy resources in that area. So again, trying to understand what it means to provide for some of the economic or reliability-based projects. And then again, if it is a regional project, the resource would be subject to the competitive solicitation process through phase 3 of the TPP. So again, to illustrate that our transmission planning process really is currently set up to handle and work through some of the storage projects that have come through. We have looked at 27 battery storage proposals and 1 pumped hydro storage proposal. We have approved 2 of those. Those happened in I can still say this, the last transmission plan that was approved by the board. One is in Oakland and the other is the Dinua project. So again, those have been handled. Those were the preferred solution, even without consideration of the SADA proposal and the market participation. So I think that's important to note that, we have found instances where even if there is no market participation, storage was the preferred outcome. And again, finally, with all of that said, we still think there are many more opportunities, and there's opportunities for more efficient use of the resource, most often as a market resource when it can more readily participate in the marketplace. So now that we are all on the same page and all levels have been set, I'll pause for questions before we get into the cost recovery options, which again was one of the primary places where we made, I think, a fairly significant and we hope fairly well-liked change to our last proposal. So any questions before I move on? Great. Cool. Okay. So I apologize in advance again that some of these, the graphics are becoming a little worn even for me. We've seen a lot of these before. I think we've seen all of them before through previous iterations actually. But again, it is always helpful to relay that ground as we step back into the space. So traditionally when we look at transmission and market resources, they kind of have their own separate revenue streams. And part of this process is looking to think about this a little differently and maybe blur a little bit more around the edges how some of those costs are recovered for some of these resources. When we're looking at SADA resources, we are looking at what we're talking about mostly right-sized facilities, or we've identified a specific project. And to the extent that we have identified that project, we will be looking to cover the network upgrades needed to interconnect that resource. Now, we're not specifically foreclosing opportunities to allow a project sponsor to come in with a larger sized resource, but to the extent they do, to the extent there are additional costs associated with that interconnection process, those will be on the project sponsor. The ISO will not be picking up that piece of the cost for the resource. Again, the resource will not be required to enter the interconnection queue. The theory behind this is we have identified and studied the resource through the transmission planning process. All of the deliverability needs of that resource have been thought through and addressed through the transmission planning process. So again, we're not looking to put that resource into the interconnection queue and potentially slow it down further. We want to make sure that resource is available on a time frame we've deemed it needed. And again, all the study processes have already been covered. So we're back to the same 3 items, and we'll talk a little bit about option 2, which we had contemplated whether or not it was necessary. We still had differing opinions on that, but it's still there, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. But again, we've got the full cost of service with the all energy market revenues being credited back to the ratepayer. We've got a partial cost of service where the resource project sponsor would be able to retain market revenues with the idea that the cost of service they would be putting into the phase 3 process would be somewhat less than their full cost of service. And then finally, option 3 is a full cost of service with partial market sharing. We're going to get into some details on, I think, we've got some proposals. We've got a proposal out there, but I think there may need to be some clarity and additional discussion on what it is we're putting out. And again, finally, this is kind of one of the core elements of this proposal, which I think we kind of get crosswise with sometimes, which is to say the resource is being approved through the transmission planning process as a transmission resource. And so anytime we have a identified need or potential identified need for that resource to act as a transmission asset, that will take primacy. So it will be a transmission asset basically until it's not a market asset until we say it's not. So again, transmission reigns supreme for any resources approved through the transmission planning process as a SADA resource. So the full cost of service option is at its core the same as what it was in previous iterations, which is to say if you make energy market revenues, all of those go into an account and they'll be credited back to the ratepayers. They'll receive full benefit for that. As we've been exploring this further, and part of this came out of the discussion of what if we have too few project sponsors, do we need to have kind of a default? Are we allowed to have all these options open to each project? And what we've identified is no, that there is a slightly different scenario that comes up. Jim, my screen went blank. It didn't come up. We had is your finger bigger than mine? No. Anyhow, sorry about that. But we did identify that there are different scenarios and outcomes that we saw as optimal based on whether the project was a direct assigned project to the incumbent PTO, in other words, a local project at 200 kV or less, relative to a project sponsor that came into phase 3 that had multiple options to choose from and selected this option. And so we wanted to go through a bit of the distinctions we saw in these options, primarily because I think as we viewed it, this was the only option for the local projects that the incumbent PTO would not have options 2 and 3, as we'll see later, available to them. So again, just very simply, we're looking at these as the only option for the direct assigned resources, simply because there is no competition. The benefits of option 2 and 3 is that we can get benefits from competition driving, rate of return or capital costs or whatever down, the split of net market revenues down, whereas in direct assignments, it goes to the incumbent PTO. And so quite simply, in the example, when we look at the total cost of service, that would equal their annual tax payments, which is the annual revenue requirement minus any credits. In this instance, the credits would be any energy market revenues. Would be 100% of that would be allocated to the ratepayers, and so that would bring down that annual tax payment. Again, the rate of return in equity would still be based on the existing rate of return for the incumbent PTO. So again, there's not an opportunity to competitively bid that. So we'll be looking to the existing rate of return that they have. And then the bidding is required as permitted by the ISO. That's a little jumbled, I understand that, but we'll get into that presently. So in these instances, we're looking at resources that are assigned directly to the incumbent PTO. We also understand that, as has been the challenge with this particular model, there's really not an incentive for the resource owner to bid the resource into the market. So in order to try and ensure that some benefit comes to ratepayers from this award, the ISO is exploring establishing a must-offer obligation. Now, this is a fairly new, this is a new aspect of this proposal. We had previously determined that, well, we don't really need to do that. If they wanted to bid, they'd have chosen one of the other options available to them, and they'd have those incentives. However, we do recognize that by establishing an offer obligation that there are potential impacts, as FERC had noted in their policy statement, for the inappropriate suppression of prices. Now, we understand that this is kind of a delicate balance that we're trying to meet here, which is to say we want this participation, but at some point we don't want that participation to come at the extent of a fully subsidized resource. And again, I think there's one of this bullets on this slide gets to this type of resource. The direct assigned resources will be what we view as the only fully subsidized resource going into the market. The other ones, we'll talk a bit more about how the contractual provisions make them different from this option, but we will look to cover all of the maintenance costs for these resources, so to ensure in their TRR, so we make sure that they are fully subsidized, they are going to be good to go. But if they participate in the market because they don't have those maintenance costs that they risk bearing themselves, we are looking at and exploring if there's a need to set a minimum price, a price above which the resource or below which the resource wouldn't be permitted to bid. We're looking at treating them somewhat akin to a reliability resource, like the reliability demand response resource, or RDRR, where they're coming in. Since it is a transmission asset, we're looking at them as kind of a reliability-based resource, but at the same time, we want them to be able to be in the market participating without suppressing those prices of the rest of the generating fleet. We haven't determined if there's a need for a must-offer obligation for like what a price would look like for charging. Our initial thinking on this right now is you figure it out. You know, we're dealing with the market price suppression issues. You figure out how to optimally get that resource charged relative to that constraint. So we'll be seeking stakeholder feedback basically on all of this element of the proposal, which is the need for a must-offer obligation, any proposed level at which a price floor may need to be set to avoid some of the market price suppression, and then again, if we need anything to consider charging portion of the resource. Yep, I figured there'd be questions on this, so we'll...
Lorenzo Christoph with Center for Renewables Integration. I want a clarification to be sure I understand the logistics, because now you'd only be giving day-ahead notice that the resource is liberated from its transmission duties to be able to participate in the market, right? Mm-hmm. So they wouldn't be able to participate in the day-ahead market.
That's correct.
Right? So this must-offer would just mean they have to offer into the real-time market. Right.
Good point. Okay. Good clarification. Thank you, Lorenzo. We'll make sure that's pointed out. Appreciate that. Mark?
Thanks, Carl. First of all, I think this proposal makes some sense to avoid price suppression. I'm Mark Smith of Calpine. Is a logical extension of this that the ancillary services would also be bid near the current bid cap for them? For spin, non-spin, regulation service?
So, candidly, Mark, we hadn't contemplated that deeply. Part of the challenge we have with that is the notification process right now is expected, as Lorenzo noted, after the integrated forward market runs. That's where we aim to procure 100% of our ancillary services. So it would be limited to any incremental ancillary services in the real time, subject to any changes that we're looking at, and I think it was the day-ahead market enhancements. But we hadn't contemplated a price cap on the ancillary services, but we can consider that. So if anybody wants to provide that as well in the comments, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, in the FMM, you also have the option to substitute ancillary services and trade them out and such. Yeah. So you would probably need a bid in that market as well.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Good input. Stephen?
Stephen Kelly with IEP. So I remain somewhat concerned about the suppression of market prices that would otherwise occur. If I understand what you're proposing here, a PTO, for example, would offer up a project that would have the effect of potentially, if it's clearing in the real-time market, lowering market clearing prices there because it's clearing by definition, but it's also lowering the TAC, I think, too.
It's also lowering its TAC, meaning its recovery is coming down. But I think, again, part of the reason, and again, we're still thinking through the level of and or need for this specific price floor. But if you're looking at those price levels, the idea of suppression at that point, at the price cap, it doesn't really exist at that point. You've run through the pool of resources. You're really looking at it as a reliability type asset at that point in time, because now you've hit the price cap. What else is out there? There's really not a suppression at that point. If you want to say that the top 5% still leads to price suppression, I suppose one could make that argument, but at that point, we've kind of put it really at the tail end of the price curve. We don't want to, kind of eliminate every single benefit that the ratepayers could have from it, but we do want to kind of find that balance between market participation and the price suppression.
Yeah, I guess my observation is simply that from a PTO perspective, for example, in your illustration, you've got double incentive to create the dynamics that lower market clearing prices and lower the tax. Mm-hmm. Combined, that could be sufficient to create bad behavior in the market.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate that, Steve. We've got 2 questions on the phone, and then I'll come back to the room. Operator, questions on the phone, please.
Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Dariush Mohammadi with Grid Bright. Carl.
Morning, Dariush.
Good morning. On slide 13, you talk about how the upgrades that are needed for a SATA resource, based on size or whatever criteria, will not be subject to revenue recovery. That it will not be included in TR. I suspect that any developer would include any such cost that is not recoverable through GitApp or any other processes, will internalize that cost in the cost of resource. So I'm not sure how this thing will work. Well, are you going to prohibit that, or because people are not going to, of course, have a situation where whatever they want to recover for this thing, for the SATA resource is less than what they spend on it. So I suspect most of the time they're going to internalize that cost. But whether they internalize it or you guys directly account for it, it's going to be part of the cost of the resource. And that would be recovered through TRR one way or another, or through the tag one way or another. Do you have any idea or suggestions on that one?
So, Dariush, I think the way, first off, if they want to include those costs in the project that comes through as the preferred solution, we'll have to assess, the potential impact and cost implications of each project. That's, I think we stated this in our paper where we said, that's not to say the project wouldn't be bigger than the bare minimum. I think there are instances where it will, just out of necessity. I mean, a lot of investment is blocky in that nature. So to say that you can't have a resource that's bigger than what you need is not accurate. But again, to the extent that the preferred solution is approved and the specs and costs for that are estimated and determined to be the right outcome, that's what's covered. And to the extent that you want to make it bigger or add these things into that preferred solution, that's additional costs that increase the risk that will not be found to be the preferred solution, correct?
I completely get that, unless you can prove that by having this, as you call it, blocky resource that is bigger than the bare minimum needed, that you can provide other benefits that more than make up for the additional cost of the blocky resource.
so again, we're looking to, as part of this, and I think this is one of the places where we've typically gone a little bit sideways on some of this discussion, which is to say the resource that's being approved here is to, again, meet an identified ISO identified need. The goal is not to say, can we build a resource such that we can have enough capacity out there to maybe make energy cheaper or whatnot. I mean, we're looking at the reliability and economic benefits, and the economic benefits are determined through congestion relief, not through resource substitution.
No, I do get that, but when it comes to especially storage, I suspect especially of certain types, there will be cases where the resource will be bigger than the bare minimum, and if the resource can prove that its TRR after accounting for market revenues that it generates are going to be less than TRR of a bare minimum resource transmission solution, I suspect that would be a consideration.
Oh, yes. I apologize if I misunderstood. I mean, it's not to say that, again, we won't make any consideration for those market revenues or the benefits that can be achieved from a different size resource. It's simply to say that resources beyond the preferred solution or resources that are looking to build something beyond the preferred solution, that's really all the focus of this slide is. Whatever the preferred solution is, those costs will be covered under the TRR.
Okay. May I ask another question on slide 14? And this may be a premature question, but if it's premature, we can come back to it later. The timing of asking this question may be premature, but it has to be done today. So we have these three sort of revenue recovery options for the resource. And I notice that, the question I have is, through a competitive process, which has its own complications, especially for certain types of storage resources, can the bidder into that competitive process select one of these three and say, I would pick option 1, or I would pick option 2, or I would pick option 3, or are we going to hone down on one option as part of this proceeding and stakeholder process, and then that will be the only option available to all SATA resource developers?
All options will be available.
So okay, that's what I thought I heard and I read. So the question would be, how do you then, if under a very hypothetical situation that 3 entities show up for the same project and suggest one of them suggests option 1, one of them suggests option 2, one of them suggests option 3 for revenue recovery, how would CAISO, and so everything else being equal, again, very hypothetical, how would CAISO determine which of the 3 resources or bidders are favorable under those circumstances? Would you have a preference on one of these 3 based on the structure that you have presented here?
So, Dariush, I apologize. The extreme nature of the hypothetical, meaning there's so many elements that go into the ISO's final determination of which project and or projects are put forward in the transmission planning, and then even additionally what goes into the final determination of the approved project sponsor in phase 3. I can't offer a straight answer on that. I can tell you it's not a matter we'd really prefer to see option 3 over option 1 or the like. It's really more of a holistic assessment of the proposals put forward to us, phase 3 of the TPP process.
Okay, thank you. Lorenzo mentioned something about you allowing projects to only as part of day-ahead to participate in the market, and as a result, a resource like that, a SATA resource can only participate in real-time market. Since you are going to let the resources know based on load level whether they could participate in the market or not, why wouldn't you do that early enough in the day so that they could participate in the day-ahead market as well? I mean, you have your day.
I'm going to ask you to hold that question, Dariush, until we get to the discussion this afternoon, or later on the notification process that Chris Devin will go through for us.
All right. Thank you very much.
Cool. All right. We had another question on the phone, and then I know we've got a couple more in the room.
All right. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I have a couple questions. Hopefully they'll be fairly quick. When you talk about net market revenues, I know we had a little discussion about this at the last meeting. I think you were talking about the revenues above the bid price. Is that right?
So we went back and looked at this, Susan, and I think what we came to the realization was that we can't make the estimates above cost. So it's basically the net market revenues are going to be, and Debbie, correct me if I misstate on this one, basically whatever revenues are made from the market netted out over the course of a month. So there'll be intervals in which they may not do so hot and intervals where they're going to do really well. So we're going to look at it over the course of a month. And to the extent that we don't have some of the cost information, we defer that to the project sponsor, and that would have to be accounted for, in their submission into the phase 3 of transmission planning process, as well as on the day-to-day basis when they're submitting their bids. So if they're going to look at option 3 with the market split, making sure that that split doesn't come down in such a way that they can't sufficiently cover their costs.
I'm not sure I understand that answer. If you're bidding into the market, presumably you want them to bid some measure of incremental cost, right? That's normally what DISA wants to see, and so they can be dispatched economically. And so when you're saying netting revenues over the month, what does that mean? Does that mean just adding them up, or what does that mean exactly?
So in this instance, there are going to be charging portions of their bill as well. So there's going to be charge and discharge aspects to their revenue stream from the ISO. And so netting that out and summing that up over the entire month and saying, okay, we have that number. Beyond those costs of, what it costs to charge, we're kind of taking a step back from that and saying, you're going to do your accounting for whatever your operational costs are. And yes, we do hope and expect that resources are bidding an incremental cost with some of the storage resources. There are costs beyond the fuel, and so trying to understand what those are. And again, we'll get to this and why we step back from some of our capital crediting proposals. We just don't know what they are. And so you can make that determination what split or what revenue return you're looking for in the resource, but we're not going to make any assessments beyond what we can calculate through our settlement systems.
Well, for example, it's a loss in round-trip efficiency, which most of these kind of resources most likely would have, how would you expect that to be accounted for here? Is that just because the charging volumes would be higher than the discharge volumes, and so it would somehow net out that way?
And then, so when we, and those will each be done at some price. And so, whatever your pricing and bidding would look to make sure those are, your round trip efficiency is covered over your charging capability, like the price differential. So let's use an extreme example and say your round trip efficiency is 50%. You need to be charging at half the price of what you'd be discharging at, right? in order to come out net positive.
Okay. If they come out net negative, would there be a credit here to the? I mean, would there be a negative credit to ratepayers somehow? Does it just go one way?
Yes.
Okay.
We don't want to incentivize reckless behavior or bidding practices. So to the extent that you kind of throw it in there and say, hey, let's see what happens. You know, we kind of do want to limit that to zero so that it's like, well, I screwed up really bad. I think and Jan is not here today. I hope he's on the phone, but this is when Jan went on vacation and left his son in charge, and his son kind of really messed it up. We kind of want to make sure Jan's at the helm and not his son.
I'm sure Jan will appreciate that.
Zero.
Okay, well, but if they want to avoid all these risks, what you're saying is they're going to have, instead of being able to just sit there and be available and get their rate of return, they're still going to have a must-offer obligation. And so, I mean, I think, well, anyway, I imagine you'll get some comments about people where you're sort of forcing them to take this round-trip risk and some others like incremental O&M and all that. With the price floor and some other things, and then forcing them to bid. I think that you might get some. The people who would take this option would likely be somewhat risk averse, and you may get some comments about that. So let me go on to
remember
more. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to remind folks that this option that we're talking about now, because it does differ a bit for those that go into phase 3. This is only for the direct assigned projects. So some of the must-offer obligation will apply only to the direct assigned projects. We'll talk a little bit more about that and why in another slide or so. So again, and because it has that offer obligation, it also comes with the opportunity for all of those maintenance and upkeep costs to be covered as well through the TRR. That's
couldn't others elect this option though? I understand it is mandatory for for a direct assigned project, but others could elect this option because they don't want to bear risk, and yet then they would have to do this must-offer obligation, and they would have to go through all this submitting and all that and take those risks. So they don't really have the option not to, if they want to elect option 1.
Yeah.
Is that right?
As we noted in the paper, we are contemplating whether or not this type of option is beneficial and or useful for the competitive solicitation process. The challenge is, and we'll get to this quite frankly on the next slide, but we have other questions in the room, so I can't come to that yet.
Yeah, I have a couple other questions too. Go ahead. Okay. Anyway, so I think you'll get some comments on this.
Okay.
Okay. And then the last question I had was on, and I think it was sort of what Darius was trying to get at, but let's say you're talking about a pump storage project and you've got, 2 or 3 turbines and, multiple turbines, but they all otherwise use the same facilities. Obviously that's a facility that's in total is larger than, potentially larger than what you might need in a particular area, or for a particular purpose. And how would you see that this whole, how would you see this all working for something like that, where there's very extensive shared facilities? Would you be able to, let's say you need the capacity of 1 turbine but not the others, would you assign everything to the 1 turbine and then the incremental cost of the other turbines you wouldn't cover? How would you do something like that?
So I'm going to start, but I'm going to kind of defer to Neil as he is and his team are more responsible for this process. But again, the first step in the process is to identify the preferred solution, which is to say, what resource are we looking at that best meets the need? I think, let me see what the language was, is the more cost-effective or efficient solution to resolve the identified need, to the extent that the project is coming in. Again, it's the whole pumped hydro project that would be coming in. So I think we need to take that into consideration, which is now where I turn it over to Neil to see if you can add something to that explanation.
So, yeah, it's Neil here with the ISO. I think our initial impression of this issue, though, is that while the local capacity model provides more flexibility for us identifying a specific need, but people proposing an oversized project,
Once we get into the transmission planning process and we're looking at storage as a transmission asset, I think we have to impose less flexibility around bolting on additional capacity to a storage device that's essentially sitting in rate base. That when we get to that stage, our initial inclination would need to be running a competitive solicitation process for a project that meets our exact needs and our ability to handle other bolted on excess capacity and so forth really gets complicated when you're talking about resources then providing where the resource itself has a component that's part regulated and part not. So, that's something that might get proposed and have to be considered in the future, but I think our starting point is to assume that when we run a competitive process for a certain resource, the whole resource ends up in rate base and it's sized appropriately to meet our needs.
Okay, so okay, I'm going to leave that one alone for now, but I think that probably needs a little more thought, because if the resource can only be built larger economically, particularly if it has maybe significant market revenues, so the net cost might not be as much. Anyway, we'll put that in comments, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Susan. John, you had something you wanted to
Yeah, this is John Gooden. This is a similar issue with RMR, that to have an RMR unit that's both RMR and market, that's problematic because it's difficult to settle that resource as to how do you settle the services it provided, the deviations, how do you apportion those costs. It becomes very convoluted and thus potentially unworkable. So.
Okay, so we're going to go back. Susan, if there are no further questions, we're going to come back to the room for a couple additional follow-ups up here, and then Stephen will get to you. So.
Darren Deffner with Pacific Gas and Electric. There's one reference to state of charge management when the transmission service is needed, and that CAIFA would have authority over state of charge management. Mm-hmm. Can you speak a little bit more about who's responsible for state of charge management when the transmission service is not needed?
So when the transmission asset is not needed, that's going to be fully within the purview of the SC for the resource that is bidding it in. But when it comes back to the next day in which it's identified for transmission need, and again, Chris will talk a little bit more about this, it is expected to come back fully charged, ready to provide that transmission service. So again, you'll know, and again, we'll talk about the timelines. I think, again, we've identified potentially a need for additional specificity about like when you'd know that you're going to be needed for transmission service the next day, so that you have sufficient time to get to that state of charge. But by and large, it's on the days you've been identified as being needed for transmission services, you will come in at midnight ready to go.
Cordia Cusick from Center for Renewables Integration. Just trying to make sure I'm sort of catching up and really understanding the option one under the direct assigned scenario. So this is the only option presumably that will have maintenance costs that will be covered by TRR.
Yep.
Any of the competitive ones will not.
That's correct.
And is that because of the move? Is that what you guys? Is that how you got there to why you wanted to get there?
Yeah. So in other words,
if the move is removed, then as would be the coverage. Okay.
Yeah, and you'll see that in the competitive solicitation, the other version of this, which is bidders into phase 3 that choose this option. They don't have the must offer obligation because, again, all right, we'll get into this now. The idea is you had 3 choices to choose from in the competitive process. You chose to take this option. And so we're not going to drive any additional incentives. If this is the best way we can get that resource built through that process, that's fine. We understand that, so we're not going to look to impose the must offer obligation, which means we're not forcing them to participate. If they participate, they'll accept whatever risks from resource degradation occur and the market price differential and blah, 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 blah. All that stuff is kind of on them because they have that option available to them. Whereas the direct assigns, in order to try and facilitate some ratepayer benefit from a SADA resource, we there is no other option. So having that must-offer obligation in place became necessary at that point. So, and as I noted to Susan, and it is on, I'm going to start getting back. We are contemplating whether or not we should make similar provisions available to resources or to project sponsors in phase 3, meaning they would have the option to be subject to the MOU and get the cost recovered, or no MOU and no cost recovered. That's kind of a question we have in our minds. Does it make sense if they've got all these other options to give them the one that is kind of the default, we didn't have anything else that we could do option?
Okay. And second question, maybe you're going to get into this later. Can you elaborate maybe a little bit more some of the challenges that had you guys sort of back away, sort of I'll call it the day plus 2 option, which would have allowed the assets to sort of participate in the ancillary services? As you just clarified, it's only incremental ancillary services that are procured in real time. So given the fact that much of the economic value of these assets will actually come from ancillary services, that would actually be a definite benefit to ratepayers.
Yeah.
So were you planning on walking us through that a little bit more?
We are planning on walking through that in much more detail later with Chris.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so Stephen, we had a question, or are you good? And then we'll go to Tony.
Yeah, this is Stephen Kelly with IEP, and following up on Susan's questions, I'm struggling with a model that says you've got a resource that can get 100% recovery of its essential, what you've identified as essential needs for TPP, but they can also overbuild the size of it, and that additional increment can be in the market. And following up on what Neil was talking about, it's puzzling to me how you're going to know or distinguish between the bolt-on that is benefiting from all the other infrastructure that was done and separate that out. I'm just really puzzling with that one.
Yeah, and I think that's the point John was making is, when you get into that parsing out of the, this bolt goes into this bucket and this washer goes into this bucket and these rubber bands and paper clips go here. I'm just having a little fun with it. But I mean, that's the point is, you get down to, trying to figure out which bucket these costs get doled out to and what's reasonable to be in each. It gets really complicated. So again, I think beyond what John and Neil have already offered on this, I don't have a whole lot more other than to say, yeah, John's right, it's complicated. Very quickly. Tony? Okay. One last check to the phones before we move on. Marvin, do we have anybody on the line? All right. Silence implies nope. Okay. So I've more or less started to get into this slide already, which is to discuss the difference between the direct assigned projects and the competitively procured projects, the resources that are picked up through phase 3 of the TPP, and the differences between them as far as choice options, why we are not looking to impose a MOU. I'm going to stop saying that today. Must offer obligation on these resources. And again, the difference that it means for some of the potential TRR cost recovery. As I also noted, we are open to feedback on whether or not it makes sense to keep this option available to those resources in the phase 3. The first instance that comes to mind to me, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is, though this has never been a problem, we've always had plenty of participation in these RFOs, but if we end up in a scenario where we just really don't have a lot of options, maybe it does make sense to revert back to something akin to a direct assigned project. So again, open to thoughts and feedback on that. If anybody has anything to offer beyond what we've already discussed, push the button, raise your hand. And Michael?
Michael Colin at UBS. I'm trying to connect this back to something you said a few minutes ago, so sorry if I'm making a connection and that's not supposed to be there. When we're going through the distinction between the competitive procurement versus the direct assigned, you had it on a slide a couple minutes ago. I'm trying to figure out how this option interfaces with sort of the planning in the queue of you had it on a slide, I think on slide 13, that a project may not jump the queue. It's sort of, first in, first out, but wouldn't you need to sort of have a distinction depending on if it was direct assigned and kind of partner with that versus if it's, competitive solicitation, you need to be connecting those dots a little bit more?
Yeah. So, again, let me clarify, because again, my concern is different worlds are colliding here. And competitive solicitation.
And maybe I'm complaining something, so.
No, we'll find out in one moment. So when we're talking about the competitive solicitation process, that is for the transmission asset. The interconnection process is for market resources typically. So those resources will go through the interconnection process. When we've identified a need in our transmission planning process, that is a need. We are now looking for a resource to fill that need. You guys can hang out in the queue for your market-based services, but we have an identified reliability need that we're going to look to have procured and built. So when we're talking about the competitive solicitation process, it's not the one for market resources or an RFO for RA capacity. This is strictly referring to the competitive solicitation process to meet that identified TPP need.
Okay, thank you for that, and totally agree. I'm still thinking that there's a difference with what you're trying to say here versus whether it's a competitive or a direct supply asset of kind of.
So the competitive,
sorry, just to finish the thought off. If there is an identified need and you're trying to figure out how to prioritize, are you trying to say here that there's going to be a difference in priority if it's a direct access versus, or a direct paired versus, a standalone asset? I mean, I'm trying to figure out.
No, the direct assignment versus competitive solicitation really has to do with the identified need and point of interconnection. So for resources that are interconnecting at 200 kV or below, those are all direct assigned projects. And so they have a defined path that they have to proceed. They don't go into phase 3 for competitive solicitation. They just go to the incumbent PTO. If it's connecting at 200 kV or above 200 kV, those have a separate path. They'll go into phase 3 of the transmission planning process, and that's how they get procured, is through that competitive solicitation process. We'll talk more offline, Michael. It's okay. Okay. Scanning. Yes.
Thank you, Carl. Fernando Cornejo with Southern California Edison. I just want to get some clarification on when you indicate that the CAISO will not assess market revenues. Is that for options 2 and 3 through the competitive procurement process in selecting a project?
Neil, I'm going to defer to you on the assessment process.
So it's Neil here. Yeah, so our current thinking on this is that starting to include too much of this potential market revenue as the benefit for what's driving the project starts to turn it into a market resource as opposed to something that actually should be sitting in transmission rates in the first place. So while we currently don't make any assessment for potential market revenues in considering storage as a potential transmission asset, and that was based on our previous understanding of the rules of prior FERC decisions, that the policy decision to some extent set aside, we're still seeing this being very problematic, starting to rely heavily on market revenues in making some of these decisions. Like I said, that actually then begs the question of, shouldn't this perhaps be a local capacity resource if we're going down the resource procurement direction?
I have a follow-up to that. Thanks, Neil. So it seems like if that's the case, that the end result would be for option 2 to start driving out option 3 as a realistic option, because if market revenues are not to be considered and a resource developer comes in $1 under the bid of another resource that's selecting option 3, the ratepayer benefits will not accrue possibly to the same degree under option 2 as they would option 3. So you're not really optimizing the solution, it seems.
I want to make sure I understand that, because again, it seemed.
Well, I think if one of the overarching objectives of the initiative is to have ratepayers benefit.
Yeah.
And if you put options 2 and option 3 side by side, and if you're not considering market revenues in the assessment, so if you come in with $1 under the bid, let's say for option 2, that would beat out the option 3 bid that's $1 above, but the potential for ratepayer benefits are dramatically different.
Yeah, so basically project A comes in, and project A and B come in, they're identical projects. Project A comes in at 99, project B comes in at 100. Would we have the opportunity to say that we would choose option B over option A, because again, at that point in time, option A, the resource owner keeps all those market revenues, whereas option B,
there's some sharing.
There's some sharing going on. I think the evaluation process, and again, Neil, correct me if I misstate, but the evaluation process is a little bit more sophisticated than simply looking at, that single dollar value to make that sole determination. There'd be other opportunities and other criteria that would come into play.
So there would be other criteria that would outweigh the potential disadvantage or detriment to ratepayer benefits that would lead to the CAISO potentially selecting that project that doesn't split the same level of earnings or revenues with ratepayers. I mean, what's the criteria? Can we talk about that, or maybe at some other point just identify them?
Carl?
You guys?
Okay, go.
Not it.
Somebody go.
Okay. I'll take a start. The criteria for selecting which competitive supplier wins if we've identified a transmission solution is very involved. It's set out in our tariff and business practice manual, so that's not a quick answer. There are a number of factors qualifying potential participants as well as in the competitive process, as well as landing on the solution itself. And cost certainty, risks of certain individual suppliers are parts of the criteria, but there's a lengthy list of criteria that we go through on comparing every offer against every other offer on those criteria, and that's very involved. So at this point, I'd have to just refer you to that documentation and let you take a look.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I apologize. I probably shouldn't have asked that question, or made that request. I understand the TPP is very extensive and detailed in its evaluation, but just something to consider, Carl, and I'll end it here, is that if all else is equal, if all these other criteria are equal, and we come up to the conclusion or to the point in time where you're making this determination based on the $1 difference for an option 2, option 3 project, is that really an outcome that you would want from a policy standpoint? Probably not, but I'll stop there.
Okay, and I understand the question now, and it's something we can talk further about. Debbie, did you have something you wanted to add on to what Neil offered?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add in is there's like 50 criteria. So the likelihood of everything being equal except $1 is infinitesimally, incredibly small.
Okay. All right.
Carl, it's Mark. I'm confused by this slide, I guess, a little bit. Are you simply saying that when you're doing your economic comparisons, you're not going to assume that there's any market revenues?
I think the way we're looking at this one is we're just making kind of the general assumption that it's kind of the fire extinguisher, which is it's there as needed. It's not going to have the incentive to participate in the market. And so when we're going through that assessment, you kind of make the conservative ruling that there's nothing forcing it to do it, so why would it? And so that's
I
really
get that, and you're doing this because the estimation of market revenues, especially over a term, is highly uncertain, and so every choice that you make using the full cost of service, one will be valid and two might result in more ratepayer benefit if they choose one of the options to refund costs back. Is that where you're getting at here?
That's support, and that's part of the discussion we had earlier about why not have the offer obligation, why not have some of the same criteria, which is we've got other options that have incentives that competitive forces can help to maximize the return to ratepayers and the benefit we get from the resource. Okay. Neil? Oh, sorry.
It's Neil here. I think I also just wanted to tag on a bit onto that answer, which is that, I am going to always keep coming back to the part that the local capacity model is preferred, where there's a much more extensive resource focus on the procurement decision. If we start making transmission planning decisions that are all for a local area that are almost totally driven by market revenue requirements, that really begs the question of why this is sitting in transmission in the first place, why it's not being procured through a local capacity type or a procurement type process, which is much more suited to addressing some of those issues. So given that this is the alternative to another mechanism that, as we've pointed out, has worked in the past, that's where we see that there's still the option for these types of values to be considered, but not necessarily as a transmission resource.
Okay. We're going to go over here to Sandeep and then over to Green. Okay, we'll start over here. Jimmy, it looks like Sandeep's. You want to just grab a different microphone, Sandeep, and we'll come over here while you're doing that.
Cornelia from Center for Renewables Integration. Clarification question on assuming no market revenues for option 1. I understand that, but is that true for direct assigned as well?
For direct assigned, again, I think we're still kind of digging into that. I think it's going to be relative to what the offer obligation looks like. And again, I don't think we've fully resolved that question yet.
Okay.
But again, to the extent that we're seeing preferred solutions that are close, it may make a difference. To the extent that there's a pretty broad gap, it may not make sense to trying to endeavor down that path. You got a working microphone, Sandeep?
I think it does work. So Sandeep Arora with Dallas Power. Just digesting this slide here, Carl. I think if we do not consider any market revenues, I don't know what would be the point of having option 2.
Okay.
Essentially, option 2's benefits really are, you're basically, you can offset TAC by market revenues. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something.
Yeah, no, I'm looking at the title of the slide and understanding how you can derive that interpretation. This is only for the option 1 resources under the competitive solicitation. We'll get to the options 2 and 3 in a moment, but if you're under that consideration and you read that heading that way, then yeah, I can see how you would arrive at that. Before we move on to option 2, I want to talk about the 500-pound gorilla that is not in the room. Which is to say, I'm kind of a believer in you don't talk a whole lot about the things that you take out other than to say it didn't work. Which is to say, we have removed the, what do we call it, the capital credit adjustment or basically trying to look at for the market participation for any of these resources and say, if you're participating, this is the degradation of the resource and the cost that you incur for that market participation from a just pure depreciation standpoint in order to arrive at a marginal cost for the resource. So again, when we're having that participation, we do want that marginal cost bid. We found the arguments persuasive that, A, we've got a ton of different technology types that could potentially come in and provide the service. B, the impact of any single discharge or charging state of charge or depth of discharge, all of those impact that. And so instead of trying to further complicate the calculations, we are, and Debbie will talk about this shortly, we are going to defer that to the contract provisions for the resources. So again, not trying to roll up our sleeves and get into determining how much every charge or discharge impacts the life cycle of the resource. Instead, really focusing on having contract provisions that ensure the upkeep and maintenance of the resource. So again, that's basically, A, everybody hated the crediting mechanism, and B, everybody basically said, you can put this in the contract, so just do it. So we're just doing it. So again, Debbie will get to that in a moment, but I wanted to put that out there so when folks are looking at this and trying to figure out what's going to be working for and or against them in some of these bidding activities, stepping back and away from that. So, we have phone questions? Okay, we have phone questions. Marvin, who we got on the phone?
So it looks like we have had a caller drop out of the phone queue.
Okay. All right. If they come back in, just let me know. So option 2, again, we really did not make any changes to option 2. The big question on option 2 really was to contemplate whether or not to keep it. Again, we had some considerations about the complexity that it would add to some of our contracting. We had a significant portion of questions that said, is anybody really going to use this? Is it viable? I know, for example, LS Power spilled quite a bit of ink on standing up and fighting for option 2. Amongst other parties, there were, I think, probably 5 or 6 stakeholders that had a pretty vigorous defense. Courtney, you guys, I know, also had one. So we are continuing with option 2 pretty much as is. So we'll be going down the same path of, we still can't make some of the forecasting and the predictions about when market availability would be. We've continued to look into that, and all it continues to do is support our previous assumption that there's sufficient sensitivity that trying to lock in those long-term predictors just is not feasible. Wait, did I get thrown off on my slides here? Yeah, okay. I'm thrown off on my slides. I apologize. So again, when we looked at this, there was still opposition, but again, most of the opposition that we saw didn't point to anything other than I just don't think it'll work and nobody will choose it, but we had sufficient people voicing a different position to say if there's not a harm and you just don't think people will use it, then we're going to continue to make it available to those that do. As Fernando pointed out, there may be reasons why project sponsors would come in and try and utilize option 2, if only to bring it in just a little bit lower and put some very small portion of the resource at risk. This is just different than mine. One moment, please. Okay. Apologies. My slide numbering got a little messed up versus what we've got on the screen here, and so I just want to make sure I was on the right slides, reading for the right examples. So again, in this option, it does provide an opportunity for the project sponsor to put forward a total cost of service or an annual revenue requirement that is a bit less than the total cost of service, but the benefit would also come in the fact that they would note the annual revenue credit to ratepayers is 0. So again, we try to keep some of the formulas the same so you kind of follow them through the examples. But there would be no adjustment there. Those would basically go into the resource owner's portion of what they were able to retain from the market revenues. Option 3 also remained largely unchanged. Again, looking at the revenue splits, we did make some clarifications about what revenues would be split, but again, conceptually, it worked out the same as it was last time. We asked the question of whether or not there needed to be a hurdle, net market revenues hurdle or threshold that the resource would have to exceed before we get into the split. And basically what we determined is trying to track that through at a level of complexity that we just didn't think was feasible, quite frankly. So all net market revenues would be split, and we would not look to have some sort of threshold. And we also considered whether or not, for ease of comparison, whether or not we want to say, and that split must be for any preferred resource. If you're choosing this option, it must be X. We determined that that was not necessary. Again, as Debbie and Neil have both noted, our Phase 3 evaluation process is quite robust with numerous criteria. And so we realized that we think we can manage having different levels of splits to assess that through the Phase 3 process. Finally, we also went through in our last iteration and said, well, what happens if we don't have enough competition? This is, kind of one of the lingering questions that's hung out there is like, if we have option 2 and somebody bids 99.999% of their total cost of service and then keeps all those market revenues, are we comfortable in the competitiveness of these RFOs? The answer is, by and large, yes. We have never, ever had a project where we didn't really have a robust pool of bidders. But hey, just in case, we are throwing out there, and I mentioned this earlier, the idea that having at least 3 qualified project sponsors to be eligible for options 2 and 3 would be the only requirement. In order to account for that, all project sponsors would also be required to submit that option 1 default. But that consideration would only come into play. We'd only really need to think about that if there are insufficient project sponsors for a given RFO. So, again, we've covered kind of the 2 main changes to our options. The first one is removing the capital credit for market participation. We'll have Debbie speak to what we're kind of moving to and thinking about as an alternative. And again, looking at slightly different options for the direct assignments versus the competitively procured, particularly for option 1. That really kind of brings to a conclusion where we're at in the second revised straw proposal on those options. Are there any final questions before we turn it over to Debbie to talk about some of the agreement provisions for SADA Resource Board? Sandeep?
Hey, Carl, just a quick question on your slide 20, which is unpredictable changes in market participation. So we understand, I mean, it's hard to predict, how much market revenue can be. You can't predict ahead of time. It's really hard. It's challenging.
Yeah.
But has ISO given any additional thought to, we did provide some comments at the last round where we said, true, it's hard to predict these market revenues, but would ISO at least provide some guidelines in terms of, here's a specific transmission need for which storage is going to be procured as a transmission solution. And so it could be a reliability need, loss of a contingency causing an overload, and storage is the perfect solution. Or it could be any other reliability, any other need, economic need. And once that need is established, would ISO only use that resource to resolve that need? Additional needs could be used for regulation? And, I mean, what would be the extent of ISO's use for the resource?
So again, I think, the idea of building that system in that local area is to ensure that we're able to maintain reliability. And though the specific need that drove the authorization for that resource may be A. If condition B arises and that resource can help address that condition, it's a transmission asset. It's used to maintain the transmission reliability of that local area. So we would have it available to us for other reliability needs beyond the specific identified need.
And besides those reliability needs, what about ISO control area-wide ACE is just going out of whack, and this resource is an effective resource to be deployed, hence that overall affects, how much regulation can be provided. Are those going to be?
Right, that's the regulations of market service, correct? So at that point, we're not we do have to get our ACE back in check. But again, these are resources that are being held for transmission needs, not for market services. Anna?
Fernando Cornejo with Southern California Edison. I guess to give myself a little visual matrix here. So under the 4 scenarios that we've discussed, whether it's option 1, direct assignment, or competitive procurement, option 2 or option 3, out of those 4 different flavors, is it true that only under the option 2, market revenues will be evaluated in the selection process?
I think there will have to be some sort of consideration under each option, except for option, well, I'll call it 1B, which is the competitive procurement. If you're into direct assignment, I think again, I'll have to work through the specifics with Neil about how those market revenues would be accounted for in the transmission planning process. But option 1B will not have any consideration for them. And again, I'm a little, I'll defer to Neil about how specifically in phase 2 and 3 of the TPP, market revenues would be considered in options 2 and 3 most appropriate.
I'm sympathetic. I see the challenge where you don't want to make these resources become market resources, but I also see the other side of the coin, where an initiative that we're looking to have ratepayer benefits for market revenue participation. As far as I think this current iteration of the proposal, as I understand it, we only have option 2 that would consider market revenues in the evaluation process.
Yeah, and I think part of it gets to as well, if you're looking at 2 projects, I mentioned this a bit earlier, one of them is, $100 and the other one is $5. Is the market revenues going to change that decision? And so it may be simply an assessment of, is it close enough to worry about in that space? In this scenario I just gave, if you're talking about 95% difference in market revenues are going to change your decision, it's probably a market resource then. So I think that there's not probably as crystal clear a line, and I think it really is as needed as how it would impact our decision-making process. So again, trying to, like you said, there's 2 sides to that coin, trying to balance the complexity and impact it may have with, it may change your decision in certain instances.
Thanks, Carl. I'm just going off of what we discussed, and I think the way it's been presented is, it really, as of today, I mean, I know it's still in flux and it continues to evolve, but the way I read it or the way I understand the presentation is that option 2 is really the only scenario where market revenues will be considered. The others are obviously a key component of the overall project and whether or not it's viable and ultimately selected. I understand there's a whole plethora of other criteria. But in the context of what we're trying to achieve here and getting ratepayer benefits, it's somewhat ironic that as far as this current proposal, that we only have 1 scenario where those revenues are actually going to be evaluated as part of the overall, spectrum of criteria.
So to the extent, again, I'm sympathetic to the ask. Please note it in your comments, and we'll try and add some more clarity in the draft final proposal when it comes out.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so Marvin, I'm going to check one last time on the phones. If there's no questions there, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie Levine. 3, 2, 1. Debbie, you want to stay seated? You're welcome to. I don't feel the need if you don't want to stand up. You want to? Okay. Okay.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So Reddy's in training, so he delegated up. So that's why you're hearing from me today. Pretty much the same answer is true. Whatever we come up with for our proposals is what we'll put into the agreement. And as Fernando just went through, we're still trying to refine what the proposal is. But just wanted to go ahead and let you know that based on kind of where we're at the moment. We'll go through the structure. I think we're blowing it out a little bit more to help you understand where we think we've gotten some consistent agreements in areas. And then we also have gone ahead and kind of nailed down 2 of the terms and conditions that have been proposed, which Carl has talked about quite a bit regarding the crediting mechanism. And then we also would like to nail down the contract terms. You know, we've gone all over the place from 5 years to 40 years to 1 year to back and forth. So we have a proposal we'd like to go ahead and toss out. So let's first go through the structure of the agreement, you know, in broad terms. Performance, we need to pretty much include in the contract what the obligation to perform is going to be, depending upon whether you're direct assigned option 1, 2, or 3. And those could be different depending upon what option you end up being. It's going to include operation and maintenance costs. The question, though, on life cycle replacement and capital additions, if we end up going with a 10-year contract versus the 20-year contract that we have been talking about, and the life of the storage unit is 10 years or is 20 years, should we go ahead and pay for capital additions? You shouldn't have any capital additions in the first 10 years of a product or a unit that's supposed to last at least that long. So we'll need to look at that. We have been having further discussions with our operations department on dispatching and scheduling, which is how we ended up with we need to do this in real time instead of the day-ahead market. CAISO operational control versus market participation, that's, I think, still being flushed out in these discussions. Accounting of market and cost of service revenues, as you heard earlier, we're going to be looking at the net positive revenues is what would be credited back. We're not going to go past that point. We had very long meetings and discussions about how we would go ahead and come up with the revenues, especially the market revenues, and how we could credit those back and forth. And all of our thinking here, if you guys have got some great ideas, please let us know. But all of our thinking here is we just couldn't come up with anything other than averaging over the month what's your net revenues that you got in the option that you have to credit them back. And if it's positive, that's what you credit back. If it's negative, then you don't have to worry about crediting it back. Implementation schedule will be based on whatever the resource is. Resource characteristics will be based on whatever the competitive solicitation requirements are, along with the interconnection requirements. So that hasn't really changed very much. The 2 new items, as I said, we'd like to get more nailed down are the crediting mechanism, which Carl talked a little bit about, and how that gets into the contract. And then the variance, I'll jump the gun on you because it comes up in like the last slide. But to understand where we think we're going is having a 10-year contract, a 20-year contract, and a 40-year contract. 10-year contracts because that's more consistent with where most of the most of the storage units capabilities are is on the 10-year basis. 20 years is because that's really what planning needs, and 40 years because if you've got a pump storage unit, that's pretty much what they're looking at for life of pump storage units. Although every pump storage unit I know has been around a hell of a lot longer than 40 years, but we figured 40 years would be a good quantity based on the other 2. So with that, what we're looking at for, what do you want to do for crediting the maintenance and replacement obligations for option 1, 2, and 3? The SATA owner should be responsible for maintaining predefined performance levels, especially in that 10-year time frame. If the generator is supposed to go ahead and have very little maintenance during that time frame, then that's all that they should be included in the contract. We shouldn't put in the contract a whole bunch of O&M that is, a potential. What we might end up doing is going ahead and adding in the contract opportunities to open it up to the extent that there's some catastrophe that ends up happening with the storage unit and we need to have it in place for transmission. The other thing is that we are going to be doing periodic testing to ensure that the transmission requirements are being met. Those will have to all be fleshed out as part of this project, coming up with what that looks like. We already do have, for those of you who don't know, or your unit hasn't gotten hit yet, we do have already in the tariff the right to go ahead and test your PMAX and your ancillary services. And so what we'd probably do is go ahead and mirror that for the periodic testing that we would do to make sure that you are meeting the transmission requirements of the transmission asset that we need in that area. So that's what we're thinking about for that. Continuing, and then I'll take some questions. Continuing on, as I said, we will probably end up negotiating depending upon what time frame your unit is in, what the maintenance and replacement costs are going to be. Cost sharing, as an example, could be based on historical performance to the extent that there is historical performance. If there's no historical performance, then maybe it could be based on, what's the intended transmission dispatch versus market dispatch. So we're open to that. As Carl said earlier, we had a big, long discussion regarding the degradation issue due to market usage. And with that, we decided the best is to just have that paid by the SATA owner without CAISO cost recovery. We put all of our brains together and we couldn't come up with anything. If you have bright ideas, please let us know. But our conclusion at this point is to just take that off the table and not deal with any CAISO cost recovery for that. But we do invite your comments on developing cost-sharing mechanisms and performance and maintenance obligations. So before I go on to the years of contracts, does anybody have any question on those items? Yes, sir.
Darren Duffner with PG&E. Really appreciate just the openness of, kind of the ongoing feedback that we can provide you of terms and conditions that we think should be included, and obviously just it's been very helpful to be able to read through the terms and conditions that were, I think, released first in the last version of the proposal. We're not to expect a draft pro forma agreement to review, provide feedback on a detailed kind of draft before the board considers the final policy proposal. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Typically, pro forma agreements are developed as part of the tariff, which is developed after the policy is approved by the board.
So in terms of the effective implementation, kind of an optimized agreement, there's always the devils in the details, kind of, that we would love to provide feedback on. The details are kind of worked out. Is there a process envisioned later on where that type of feedback could filter into the very detailed agreement that you're putting together?
Yes. Our anticipation is once the board approves the policy, then we would go ahead and develop a pro forma agreement. For those of you that have been involved in the regional coordinator services agreements, we put that out in advance of the balance of the tariff. So that way we could have a couple of iterations of it before we actually did the tariff language. That would be my stance at this point as to how we would do the same thing for SATA agreement. Any other questions in the room? Any questions on the phone? Excellent. Okay, so as I said, cutting to the chase earlier, what we're thinking at this point is to go ahead and do a 10-year, 20-year, and 40-year terms, and then the terms and contracts might vary based on whatever the term and condition is as far as cost recovery is concerned of different items based on the resource technology characteristics and the transmission requirements. But the bulk of the pro forma agreement will have the same items in it. It just might be the performance will be not as high of a bar in a 40-year it'd be a higher bar in a 40-year contract to make sure you meet it all the way out versus in a 10-year contract. Maintenance obligation, capital additions, as I said, we might not have capital additions in the 10-year contract, but definitely the 20 or the 40 if the resource is only supposed to last 10 years, obviously, because we need it for whatever time frame we come up with the contract. And we're open to any comments on, does 10, 20, 40 sound good? Understanding that we might go ahead and make variances between the 10, hold on 2 seconds. Understanding that we might make variances between the 10, 20, 40. Any comments along those lines in the next round would be greatly appreciated. Yes, sir, question.
Michael Colvin again with EDF. So on the 10, 20, 40 issue, it seems to me that there's a balance between the expected useful life of the asset and also sort of knowing that CAISO's got to start really planning for a very different grade given some of the state goals that are out there. And I'm wondering, and this might just be part of our comments, but I'm wondering if you've given any thought of the 20 and 25-year time horizon, given the fact that we've got SB 100 on the books, we've got some other things that are sort of out there, and what the financing risk might be if we're going beyond that 2045 cutoff date.
So the thought is that, you'll end up with some contracts will be 10 years, okay? Some contracts will be 20 years, and some contracts will be 40 years, okay? The pump storage units will be 40 years if a pump storage unit wins the competitive solicitation. That's what'll end up in the 40-year contract. So if you look at it, let's say in 2020, we do a 10-year contract, things change between 2020 and 2030, then those will be incorporated into the next version of the 10-year contract. Whoever signs up for a 20-year contract, then in essence, they're agreeing to that contract for 2020 all the way to 2040.
Right. I understand that the counterparty is going to agree to whatever contract that they sign. I'm more thinking about it from the CAISO perspective of there's so many moving pieces. Does it even make sense to have the contract term be pegged to expected useful life, given the fact that you might need some more flexibility and might not want to be signing up some pretty long-term contract horizons right now?
Why don't you go ahead and provide some comments along those lines, and we'll take a look at it.
Great.
But this is what our thinking is at the moment.
Great.
So, Debbie, if I may, this is Carl. Our goal here was really to try and strike a balance, which was to say some needs may be not necessarily there in 10 years or 20 years. And so we may have the ability to look at projects a little bit differently. Again, this is kind of permeated through many of the stakeholder comments that, that level of flexibility where we don't have to look at it as a 40-year asset provided us opportunities to examine different resources for needs that may dissipate. But having said that, we aren't trying to peg it to a variety of different years. We didn't want to set it up in a pro forma fashion because, as Debbie's noted, some of the provisions will be slightly different depending on the duration of the contract, and so trying not to pin it to a specific date into the future as far as other policy objectives go, but keeping it as a pro contract that's managed across multiple different resource types, but allows us flexibility.
If I can just push on that for one more second, I totally get that. Very logical, makes a lot of sense, and I get that you're also trying to take things to expected useful life of an asset. I'm curious what other factors you might want to be thinking about as you're negotiating out the term of a contract other than expected useful life that would be sort of a factor going into this.
Well, I went back to slide 27. So those are all the different factors that will be incorporated into the contract. So, I mean, to the extent that it's won the competitive solicitation, it then has to meet all these different factors in the contract.
But not each of these are going to influence term length of the contract necessarily.
True.
So that's what I'm trying to get at is, to speak very plainly, I just don't want to see us signing up very long life contracts for something with contractual provisions and it turns out that it's a weight around our neck that we don't actually want or need, and especially since this is such an emerging area right now. So there's an associated risk with very long-term contracts on such kind of an emerging field. And so I'm trying to figure out, in your thinking, what is, what are some of those factors that are going to go directly into the term length? So expected useful life, I've heard a couple of times. This resource list is really helpful, but I'm trying to figure out what you all are thinking about so we can give you the right comments on what the right term lengths are.
Go ahead, Neil.
It's Neil here. I don't think we can provide a comprehensive list, but I think I could provide just one example to try to demonstrate why we see we need the flexibility that Debbie's laying out here. One example is, frequently we hear the ideas raised in planning about, is this an alternative project or are you simply deferring a project to a big transmission upgrade to a later time? Now, there are times where if you don't move now, the right-of-way will no longer exist and there is not an option to move forward. Now, in that situation, that kind of issue would be the one that would tend to have us saying in the planning stage, if we're going down the storage route, there might not be a way back. So there we do require longer-term contracts to protect our ratepayers from the fact that options are disappearing. So that's one example where saying, well, you think of it as a short-term deferral of a larger project. That doesn't work if that transmission project could be built now, but it cannot be built in 10 years.
Thanks, Neil. Any questions on the phone? Okay, operator, could we get sorry, Mark. Hold on 2 seconds. Can we get the question on the phone?
Yes, caller, your line has been unmuted.
Hi, this is Dariush with Great Bright. Hello, Debbie. The question I have maybe should be answered by others, but related to the contract term. If for some particular reason we have two projects competing for a TPP solution, one has a 10-year contract, one has a 40-year contract, or for a 10-year term, and the other one has a 40-year term, and there's a good chance that the one with a 40-year term would have a much higher cost because it's going to last a lot longer. Using cost as a way of using ratepayer benefit or whatever criteria for determining which project to pick, the only way to make sure that these projects could be compared on the same level would be
so, Dariush,
yes.
let me cut you off there. As Carl said when he started out, we're not talking about the competitive solicitation process in this proceeding. So you got to remember that whatever the competitive solicitation process is, they make a decision as to who wins. Whoever wins is who I contract with.
No, I understand that. I know you're not talking. That's why I said maybe the answer should come from other parts, from other folks in the room. But the idea was whether this will be per year ratepayer impact that would be compared, or is it the total ratepayer impact? Because it just in order to compare these resources side by side, there should be a way of normalizing the ratepayer impact.
It's Neil here. Darius, I think what Debbie was getting at was actually that this isn't the stakeholder process to have that discussion in. That's a discussion we want to have on a case-by-case basis inside the transmission planning process, as opposed to saying something generically here that we would have to reconsider on the case-by-case basis anyway.
Thank you. Understood.
Thanks.
Okay, Mark, thank you for waiting.
Thanks. I actually was going to ask a question similar to Dariush's, and I understand you don't want to talk about some other process in this process, but you've kind of opened the door to that by suggesting that you were going to allow temporally different projects to compete with each other. I completely understand how a short-term battery installation, for instance, to defer a longer-term transmission upgrade makes an enormous amount of sense. In that case, you're not comparing, a 5-year battery contract or a 10-year battery contract with a 40-year transmission asset. You're simply deferring that investment. But if you have contemporaneously a 10-year, for instance, storage offer and a 40-year transmission alternative to reconductor or build a new right-of-way or do something like that, at a minimum, I think, since you've introduced the term issue, you need to help us understand how those would be compared. That's a comment, not a question. Thanks.
So noted. Asked and answered. It's part of the transmission planning process. They make those determinations over as part of the transmission planning process. And as Neil has already said, it's on a case-by-case basis. Okay. Carl, on to Chris.
So we are sitting here at 10 minutes to 12. I think if we push through, we can probably be done by 12:30. But I understand if people are feeling the low blood sugar kind of thing working. So push through. Pushing through. Chris, you have the platform.
All right. Morning, everyone. Sorry to be standing in between you and lunch, but we'll try to get through some of these. I'm sure you probably have a lot of questions, though. So I just wanted to note, we're going to talk about this SATA market participation notification process, and we have had a number of previous iterations of this part of the proposal, and got a lot of feedback from stakeholders that we've been thinking about. It's quite a difficult issue to try to tackle, and we've been talking with our planning folks, our operations, and our technology teams a lot about this issue. So first, I'm just going to recap a bit about how we have gone through some of the prior proposals and where those all shook out, where we are heading in the future for this iteration, and why, and then I'll get into some of the details on the actual proposal that we have in front of us now. So I'll try to get through this background pretty quickly. Previously, we had potentially 2 or 3 different proposals for how to do this notification process. First was trying to attempt to identify ahead of time the specific time frames, like hours, months, days, or seasons that resources could be permitted to provide either market services or be needed for transmission. In a previous proposal, we said that was probably not going to be possible due to the difficulties in trying to provide that kind of certainty in that forward time frame. And then in the last iteration, we proposed perhaps we would be able to either look at one of 2 options using either the day-ahead market or the prior to the day-ahead market processes that we have in place. Now, we got a lot of feedback from stakeholders that were very supportive of using the prior to the day-ahead market. We heard some folks asking about ancillary services and other type of issues that would be allowed through that type of a process. Unfortunately, after we reviewed that, with our operational folks. There was some concerns about the limited availability of the forecast and resource bids that are used in that process. So I think that was one of the reasons why. Hold on one second. Does this sound better? Good? Okay. Sorry about that. So that was the reason why we have moved away from that prior to the day-ahead market option for this iteration of the proposal. It just seemed like there was a lot of concerns over the possible lack of information that would be needed in our prior to the day-ahead market run that we do. Okay, so for the option 1 that we were talking about previously, which was use the day-ahead market RUC process, there was a lot of concerns from stakeholders that thought that that might not actually work very well as far as the idea of actually reflecting the constraints that and needs that were actually identified in the transmission planning process. And after we went back and reviewed that, we do tend to agree with that at this point. Looking a little bit harder into the issues there, we thought that that would probably not work as well as we had initially thought. So that leads us to where we are now for this iteration of the proposal. Let me just touch on a couple other things that haven't changed from the initial aspects of this notification proposal. The first one being we're still proposing that any notification for this would be done for a 24-hour period due to the needs basically for potential forecast error and other resource availability and making sure that the resource would be fully charged for the day that it's needed to deliver. So we're continuing with that aspect of the proposal unchanged. And then again, this is just an overview of the whole concept in general. We need to indicate to resource owners when the actual resources will be permitted to participate in the markets and when they will be needed for transmission service. Once we actually notify a resource owner that it will be allowed to participate in the market, then that owner of the resource will be responsible for any bidding market participation, not the ISO. This next aspect is a little bit of a new concept that we're throwing out there. We did put in the proposal that we would identify all market participants. Once the need was identified, we would notify all market participants of the designation of a SATA resource as a transmission asset through our CMRI tool. We do want to get some feedback on that because I think that is a kind of like an NDA tool that might not be as open to all public information as possible as we might need, but so I do want to get feedback from stakeholders about that idea. But that seemed like it might be a good tool to use for this kind of notification process for all the market participants to know. Similar to kind of how today we do for our transmission constraint activation process, we noticed that through our CMRI tool as well. We thought there were some parallels with that. Okay, so with that, I'll pause there, ask about questions, and then I'll get into the actual proposed notification process. Steve?
Chris, Stephen Kelly with IEP. Could you just walk roughly through the CMRI tool that you use, when that notification would occur and so forth?
Yeah, we haven't really thought too much into particular details about when each notification would occur. One of the things that we got to figure out is, would we be notifying folks every single day if they were either a market asset or transmission asset? Would we be notifying all the market participants, those kind of things, and when? Those kind of questions we haven't really determined yet, so I think we would like feedback from stakeholders on that. But if you have any opinions now, I'm sure we could discuss.
It strikes me, I'm not sure about when the notification, but when it occurs, it probably should go to all market participants so everybody understands and appreciates that.
Certainly, I think we do agree with that, and I think the idea was that it would need to be at the latest sometime around 7:30 p.m. the day before, prior to, because that's when the start of those real-time markets start happening. So results start being awarded. So I think that would be at the latest possible, but I think we would like to do it sometime around the time when all the other day-ahead market results are released as well, which is 1 p.m. Prior to the real-time day. So That's our initial thinking right now, but if other folks think that we need to use a different tool, some folks have said post it on Oasis. That is more of a purely public thing that you don't need an NDA for, so that might be a better option than this, but something more to think about. And then I do want to note that it is going to be important that for the next proposal we nail down exactly when and how we're going to do it. And, is it going to be that every single day that the resource just assumes they are going to be a transmission asset, and then only on the days that we say, yep, okay, you can go and be a market participant, then we notify them then? Or is it that we notify them only on the days that they're needed for transmission, and they could assume every other time that they're available for market participation? Those are some nuances that we didn't include because we made so many changes to this aspect of the proposal. At this point, we're still not quite sure how it should work. So would appreciate any feedback on that kind of concept as well, which is related to all these notification issues. Over here, then here.
Darren Defner with PG&E. Given the earlier comments on the full expectation that it's just real-time market participation, if I'm hearing you correctly, even though you don't have a specific time in mind detailed of when notification would occur, it would not be available before like 10 a.m. for day-ahead participation. There's no expectation that you'd be able to do a notification before 10 a.m.
Yeah, unfortunately, given our operational concerns and, some of that accuracy issues that I was mentioning earlier, at this point, that's where we are, is that unfortunately, we wouldn't be able to provide that result prior to the day-ahead bid submission timeframe. So, I think it's really based on the fact that our operators want to see those, load forecasts be closer to the real time before they ultimately make that decision. But, of course, we do welcome more feedback if there's other ideas that folks have about how we might be able to accommodate that. But, again, there's also the whole idea of these tests and notification process also does have some computational concerns as far as doing the market runs if we use market-based tools for those as well. So that was something else we had to talk to our folks about as well. Right here.
Corinne Akisik from Center for Renewables Integration. So I don't really understand the whole dispatching and operations process very well, so this is granted a sort of a high-level question, but is this, the reasons that you basically sort of removed the sort of day plus 2 option, are those just sort of it's hard, or it's just there's complete flaws in which that keeps you from doing it? And to the question of whether it's hard, are you guys already planning, computational upgrades, software upgrades, which would make this possible, 2 years down the road or something like that, or cause you to revisit it? And the reason I'm sort of harping on this is because of, sort of value to ratepayers. I mean, the whole point of this exercise and what we're going through has been value to ratepayers. And so we've discounted, you look at like where's energy storage providing value, certainly some of these shorter term assets. It's in, capacity markets and it's in ancillary services. We've taken out capacity, now we're taking out ancillary services. So we're doing a lot of work for the lowest possible value stream that energy storage can provide.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. I think, you make some very, very good points that, we have been struggling with on this aspect of the proposal. So I will say that I think we have some responses to some of those aspects of the questions, and then maybe perhaps some good light at the end of the tunnel that I can let you know right now. But first off, I want to touch on that question about, is it just hard or is it just too complicated and those kind of things. Well, one is if we use some market-based tools like we had possibly thought about doing previously, we think that those may have some computational processing time concerns to actually be able to solve the day-ahead market in that time frame. That is one of the problems. The other major problem is just the forecast accuracy. And so that's not really a hard thing. That's more of a reliability concern. And since these are intended to be transmission assets first and foremost, our operational folks have some major concerns about, stating that they are able to be a market-based resource prior to that time frame that we're talking about now, which is really during the day-ahead market time frame. And so, that does preclude them from participating in the day-ahead market, as you noted. So that's the answer to that part of the question. But then I do want to note that we certainly understand this concern that you noted about, okay, hey, can't be getting capacity dollars for this type of resource. Now it looks like you're saying you can't get any ancillary services dollars for these kind of resources. That is certainly concerning to most folks, I'm sure, and the stakeholders would probably all agree with you on that. But I think one of the good things we want to note is there is a current consideration in our other stakeholder initiatives, the day-ahead market enhancements process, that we would potentially rerun the ancillary services for the real-time market. Now, I don't know much of the details of that. There are some still ongoing concerns on that part of the proposal from operations about their need to validate the ancillary service results from the day-ahead market. So that may provide an opportunity to get some ancillary services dollars for these type of resources in the future if that other day-ahead market enhancements proposal does come to fruition. But again, that isn't a guarantee at this point, and I don't know a lot of the details of those discussions, but that is something that I was told could possibly help out with this kind of concern. So, sorry I don't have much more than that to add at this point, but I do definitely encourage folks to, provide those written comments, including those kind of concerns, and the ISO will have to weigh those when we decide where we're ultimately going to go with this. So, with that, any follow-up or other questions before I actually get into the other detailed part of the proposal? Anything on the phone? Good? Okay. All right, so let's talk about the latest proposal for this notification process and how we would do this. Again, as I noted earlier, this one's pretty tough to crack, but the idea here would be using a load-based notification process, load-based test, essentially, to determine if these data resources would be needed. So rather than using the day-ahead market RUC process, which we were thinking about using previously, this would be a different type of a process where we would look at the load-based, just basically the load and import capability into load pockets, as well as the other possible resources that could assist in those needs, and then make a determination at that point if they would be needed or not. So we think that this would address some of our concerns about the possibility that these tests might not actually identify when the need was actually there, which was some of the feedback we got on the day-ahead RUC process that we had previously proposed. So with that, again, in the day-ahead market time frame, we would perform this following test, which would identify when status-based resources were needed for transmission service. Essentially, we look at the load forecast in the local load pocket area, all the available capacity from other local area resources, and then the import capability into the load pocket. And once we do that, we compare those resources and needs, and if the operations folks believe that that will be needed, then we would designate the resource as a transmission asset. Okay, sorry, I just said the top bullet. But again, the idea is just to consider those three concepts and then designate the resource for the whole following 24-hour period. Again, the resource, some of this was touched on earlier, but the resources are expected to be fully charged starting at 12 a.m. of that delivery day and would not be allowed to participate in any of the real-time market processes for the whole following calendar day, 24-hour period. One of the other things we wanted to note is that the load that would be studied in this process would include an additional 10% operational reliability margin that our operators have asked for, due to the possibility for forecast error. Again, one of the major concerns that they've had throughout this whole process about reliability issues. So if we did not look like we were not going to go over that load forecast need, then we would release the SATA resource and they would be allowed to participate in real-time markets for the following day. Again, this last slide here just indicates why we included that 10% operational reliability margin into that load forecast that we would be looking at and doing this test. Okay, so with that, I will open it up for questions. Two on the phone? Okay, let's go to the phone.
Moving to our first question. Caller, your line has been unmuted.
Hello, this is Dariush with Great Bright again. I was wondering about this proposal. I think this is a definite improvement on the previous proposal. And the process has become more straightforward by focusing on something that a typical operations engineer would look into. So, my question is, if the concern is with the accuracy of the load forecasts, why wouldn't CAISO increase the margin, the safety margin? Now you're proposing like something like 10% to a bigger number, and make the determination before day-ahead market. The reason I'm suggesting is not only because of the possibility of the resource making more revenue for the ratepayers and improving its performance in that regard, but also because some resources may need more time. There may be consideration for charging. If you tell somebody a resource like this, you have only 3-4 hours to charge, or 8 hours to charge, or whenever you inform them, and be loaded, locked, and ready, as Neil puts it, then the best thing is to do is to give them as much time as possible for them to do that, and the sooner you inform them from reliability standpoint, that's better. And if the concern again is accuracy of the forecast, then increase your margin, safety margin on the forecast. But provide notify the resource early in the day before, in the day ahead, so that they can decide whether they can participate in the day-ahead market, or if they're supposed to be fully charged and locked and ready to provide transmission service, that they have sufficient time to make sure that they have the reservoirs filled, or if the battery, that there are no, sometimes there are transmission constraints for charging operation, that they have time to work around those constraints. So that's my point, that it is not only for higher revenue, but I think even for system reliability, it's paramount importance that we inform the resource before the day-ahead time frame.
All right, Darius, thanks for the thoughts, and I'm glad that you think this one has been an improvement. I think we would agree, but I do believe that we did discuss some of those concepts when we were thinking about this proposal, but I would say it's fair to ask, hey, why not do it in the day-ahead process, prior to the day-ahead process, if you add an additional reliability margin, since we are saying that has been the major concern that we have. We were really working in kind of the confines of the operators saying that they really wanted this to be only done in that day-ahead time frames for only the real-time market availability process, but I think it's fair to ask the question. I think it's fair to consider that a little bit further. So I've taken some notes on that, and I think we will have to think about that pretty hard in our consideration of what this will finally look like. It might be possible, but I don't want to say that we're definitely able to do that at this point. It's going to take more discussion on our part, but I think that's a fair question. And then I think on your second point, as far as, providing additional reliability, there may very well be some longer resources that take a long time to charge. I'm not very familiar with, or I don't have a good sense for that personally, but I think it's a fair comment to say that it might need, longer than 3 or 4 hours to charge, and so you'd want to do it before like 7 or 8 at night, the night before. The other thing that you got to think about as well is that some of these resources would probably only be needed for like 4 hours at a time. So we do want to balance that though. So some fair points there and things to think about. I think, Darius, thanks for the comments. And then we got another question in the back of the room, and then I'll jump back to the phone. So go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Chris. Mark Smith of Calpine. You're on the right page. So after the day-ahead market runs, you're going to get load forecasts, available capacity, and import capability. Isn't that what the IFM does? How is this any different than what the IFM does?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think I can give you a really good response to how it would be different, but I think that the real major difference that I can identify at this point is that it's just the time frame as far as the accuracy of the load forecast that we would be.
Unless you're going to look at the specific constraints that may have not been modeled in the day-ahead market prior to the need for this battery, that would make all the sense in the world.
So, Mark, this is Carl at the ISO. Are you suggesting that the ISO simply insert these resources into the market as a market resource, run the IFM, determine if we need it as a transmission asset, pull it in, leave it in or pull it out, depending on what the need is, and then rerun the IFM absent the resource? I'm just trying to understand. At that point, again, our previous proposal was basically that we try and do something, a simplified version of that. We also looked at issues like CME and the complications that adds. Chris mentioned the runtime, the contingency modeling enhancements would, the more enhancements we have to add, the longer the runtime gets to the point of infeasibility. And CME, again, also is only looking at, I think it's the 30-minute line limit, whereas we're probably looking at longer duration line limits, whether it be the 1 hour, 2, 3, 4 hour line limits. So again, some of these things, these limitations just don't get captured in the IFM or modeled sufficiently in the IFM, which is one of the reasons why we're looking at holding out to a later point beyond that to see kind of where our line limits stand after the IFM is run.
Okay, that's fine. I wasn't proposing anything. I was just trying to understand how it's different.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. I think there's still one more on the phone.
Moving to our last question. Caller, your line has been unmuted.
Hi. Hi. This is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I'm sorry, you have to wait for the person to tell you that the line is unmuted, so I apologize for the delay there. I just had a question. This whole thing is really geared for a SATA that was chosen for a reliability reason. But I'm wondering how, if the ISO has given any thought to if a SATA is chosen for another purpose, like a policy or economic reason. How would you be making the determination of whether they would be needed as opposed to playing in the market?
Yeah, very good question, Susan. Thanks. The short answer is we don't really know yet. I think this is really been the major focus of our discussions internally, is trying to figure out a way that we could do it for more of these local load pocket areas, which is where we think the vast majority, if not all of these type of SATA projects would most likely be selected. So we certainly understand that those other types of projects have been included in the scope of this. And if you have any thoughts about how we might do that, I think we could consider those. At this point, we don't have a proposal for those kind of projects.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions in the room on the notification process, the latest proposal, or any of the issues we discussed? All right. We look forward to getting more feedback on this and developing this aspect of the proposal a little bit further, including some of those things I noted about the time frame, what tool we should use, and we will think about that comment that Darius made. I think that's a fair thing to think about as well. So thanks for everyone's thoughts. Carl, back to you.
Okay. So I'm not going to bother standing up because I need to clicker them. Oh. Might as well have just stood up. So just did want to, so the wanted to reiterate, again, the cost allocation aspects of the SADA resources. Again, we are not proposing any changes. We still get some pushback on the idea that if it's relieving a system system identified need, we should put that into the system TAC. It is a question really, again, of the interconnection standpoint. We do this today. Our position on cost allocation has not changed. We know, yeah, I see my, okay. So again, this is consistent with current practices. We understand that folks may disagree with this, but in order to change this practice for SADA resources, it would require a much more significant overhaul of the overall interconnection process as far as, or transmission process, planning process for those cost allocations. And so I think as part of this, we are looking to maintain our current practice. So with that in mind, we'll just wrap up really quickly with our next steps. Comments are due November 6th. We will put out a template. Well, I guess I'll ask, do people want a template? Some people don't use it. Template? Yes, no? Yes? Okay, template. Template will come out in the next day or so. Again, we've got all of the information, including stakeholder comments and previous drafts of the proposal on our initiatives page. The draft final proposal, we are looking to get this out in December. Part of the big basis for this is, as I think a couple of you probably know, our annual transmission planning process wraps up and goes to the board in March of each year. We would like to have this completed prior to that March board, which means we got to get to the February board. So again, we'll be looking to put out that draft final proposal in early December. And comments will, I think we'll get those around the 25th of December. Thank you. But get those before the end of the year so that we can, again, have everything ready and wrapped up and have a bow on it and something we can give as a late Christmas present to our board in February. So with that, are there any final questions before we wrap it up for the day and let everybody get out of here? Outstanding. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.